Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. This is Keep It Real episode number 18. I'm going to read a tweet here from January 3rd from Doug's account at GreenFeetPT, if you want to take a look at it. The tweet says, "Why is sprinting technique something that supposedly self-organizes without coaching, but Olympic requires instructional progressions doing?" This was something that he was inspired by from the Track and Field Consortium and Eat, Sleep, Train at a conference that he attended virtually, and just want to take that and just kind of explain it a little bit, Doug, and we'll kind of unravel it.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of inspired by that talk because they were speaking to kind of maybe the bias in strength and conditioning and sports performance towards the weight room, and I think that a lot of people are coming around to the fact that probably like the speed aspect should be the primary emphasis and that the strength work should support that. But I think there's still, I mean, if you look at most strength coaching certifications, they probably do spend a lot more time going over like Olympic lifting and in squatting and deadlifting progressions and technique than they do sprinting technique and progressions. And I would bet that, probably more, SESs have like a weightlifting certification than they do a USA track and field certification. And just kind of makes you wonder. I mean, if you look at the track and field world, like the goal there is to get people to run faster, jump higher, throw further, which are things that like probably define even team sport athletics. And in the track and field world, they use weight training certainly to get athletes faster, to throw further. Like, I mean, the shot putters are probably stronger than football players. So track coaches are using the weight room, but they're using it as a means to an end, not as the end itself. And so I kind of wrote, why is it that we consider like Olympic lifting to be very technical and it warrants like a lot of time to teach? But I think that there's kind of this idea that sprinting is this natural activity and that athletes, quote unquote, like self-organize. And if you just tell them to run or chase people around, they're going to run the quote unquote right way. And I'm not saying that people should be, that a team sport athlete needs to run as well and look like an Olympic sprinter. But I think that there's things that team sport athletes can take from track and field in terms of like key positions. And, if you look at like the final heat of the 100 meters in the Olympics, like what's considered good technique in that competitive arena is different than what's considered good technique in team sports. So I think there are a lot of team sport athletes who probably egregiously violate a lot of the principles in upright running in the track and field model, and just doing some very basic things can make those athletes, the team sport athletes, faster, probably have a lower potential for injury and improve overall performance without a huge investment in time. We're not asking these athletes, team sport athletes, to like look as good from a block start as an Olympic sprinter would be. But I think to say that like, well, track and field is track and field and team sports are team sports, and that, team sports can't learn from track and field in terms of upright running when, you get the fastest people in the world. There's probably something that they can teach people that aren't as fast just because they might happen to run with a ball or an implement. So I think that it comes down to like, to say that I think it doesn't matter at all in terms of technique in team sports is very, very lazy. I think if we're going to say that like, we're going to spend a lot of time teaching Olympic lifts, and I'm not saying Olympic lifts are bad. I think that, you utilize properly, like they're fine. But if we're going to take the time to teach somebody like a squat or a clean or a clean or a snatch, but we're not going to, we're just going to say, well, athletes go run. We're not going to cue technique. We're not going to quote unquote coach it. We're just going to tell people to do it. I think that's a little bit lazy because I think that sprinting is technical and it does require some coaching. Maybe it shouldn't be, it shouldn't dominate the entire session where you're spending so much time on technique and you're not touching on other qualities and you're not emphasizing output and actually running with intent. But again, we avoid extremes. To say that it doesn't matter, I think, is lazy. And to say that we should be holding team sport athletes to the same standard as, a track and field sprinter is also probably a little bit irresponsible as well. And it was interesting discussion. Some of the comments that came up were, human beings, they use the word evolved to run. Therefore, running is a more natural activity, whereas we didn't evolve to, do the clean and the snatch. Therefore, the clean and the snatch should require more coaching. I mean, the evolutionary argument is interesting because you can justify any human behavior, you can justify with evolution. Like sitting behind a desk and being sedentary and staring at a computer screen and playing video games, we evolved to do that because we're here and we're doing it. We evolved to abuse drugs. We evolved to drive cars. So like, yes, throughout most of human history, like there probably was more of an impetus on or a need to do, locomotive type activities than there is now. But even if you look at sprinting, right, like we didn't necessarily evolve, we didn't survive as a species because of our sprinting ability, except for until we started domesticating animals like cows. I would imagine that like most of the things that we ate throughout human history and from like an evolutionary time perspective, we probably could not outrun our prey. What allowed us to catch our prey was through like, group hunting tactics, socialization, and our brains. We weren't like physically superior to the animals that we ate. Like, do you think that, people that ate buffalo 200 years ago were outrunning buffalo? Like, hell no. If they were relying on their sprinting ability to survive against buffalo, we wouldn't be here, right? They also learned how to ride horses and hunt buffalo on horses. So we were actually riding on other animals.
I'm picturing you in your short shorts, like chasing after a buffalo with a spear and like outrunning him and then turning around.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if there was enough spears, we could get the buffalo down, but I'm not defeating the buffalo by outrunning it. So the evolutionary argument is interesting, but I don't think that, like we necessarily evolved to be great sprinters. And even if we have the biological genetic capability to run well, whatever that means, because throughout much of human evolution, we were more active and we relied on locomotion more than we do now. There's also a huge environmental component to it. So like, even if you're like a really high level athlete, you probably went to school at some point in your life and you spent 8 hours a day behind a desk, sitting in a chair, listening to your teachers. So like nowadays, even like the best runners in the world they have a genetic predisposition to doing it, but they're also trained and coached to run a certain way because, unless you live in like a hunter-gatherer society, which most people don't now, like even the people in the final heat of the Olympics, they didn't grow up running away from wild animals. They grew up being socialized, going to school, and somebody noticed they were fast. They probably got either discovered track and field on their own or somebody discovered them because they were fast in a team sport and they were coached to run the way that they do. So I don't think that like sprinting to run like 10 meters per second is something that we like kind of evolved to do. So I don't know if that evolutionary argument, and it's a common one, like should really explain why we put a lot more of an emphasis on, regarding Olympic lifts as technical, but as sprinting as something as natural. And kind of the last point, before you guys chime in, is the idea of self-organization. And it's often said that like, well, we just self-organize to run. If we play games and stuff like that, people will find the best technique. I think it's problematic to say that just because someone sort of stumbles upon a certain technique on their own, that's necessarily the best solution. And a lot of times, like, athletes don't live in an informational vacuum. Like most athletes have been coached, good or bad, to do certain things. So like if we get an athlete, right, and we say like, okay, like whatever, your leg hurts when you run, let's watch you run on the treadmill. The chances of that person, like that technique that we look at the first time being quote unquote natural, I think is pretty low because most people have been told things. So like if it's somebody that ran cross country in high school, what if their coach told them like, yeah, if you want to run faster, you should lengthen their stride? That's not self-organization. They internalized an idea and they were trying to respond to that cue. And it could be the case that 10 years later, they're doing the same thing, or they're still hearing that coach's voice in their head. So we don't live in an informational vacuum. Most athletes don't have this perfect training environment where they're exposed to all of these like rich sensory motor experiences where now they can find without cueing the best solution. Now, I think that coaching allows for effective self-organization because if you're coaching, you're exposing the athlete to the proper training environments. You're allowing them to find the right solutions. But I think that we shouldn't assume that all athletes have access to good coaching. And self-organization also relies on having certain things available to you. So like, for example, if let's say we accept it to run well, your legs have to achieve certain joint angles. Well, what if you had like an ACL surgery where you were never rehabbed properly and you're lacking knee flexion and hip extension because, you never like worked on your quad early on in surgery. Well, if you're watching an athlete run and now they've got a low heel recovery, are you going to say, well, that they self-organize and that's the best thing? Or are you going to dig deeper and say, why do you have a lower heel recovery on one side versus the other? It could be because they don't have that joint range of motion available to them. So I think that the self-organization thing requires a lot more layers and scrutiny. And just to say that athletes just automatically self-organize to find the quote unquote best solution, because that's what evolution, kind of like facilitated. I think, again, we have to dig way deeper than that.
I think your point about the self-organization is huge, because I think we think that everybody's a blank canvas when they come and see a coach or a therapist or whatever, and nobody is, unless they have literally never seen another, never had a sport coach or anything like that. Like, unless they're 8 years old and they've just been playing in the backyard by themselves and not having any outside input, then they are truly, a blank canvas, self-organizing. But like you said, everybody has been taught or told to do something when they're moving by a sport coach or by a parent, right or wrong, that impacts how they move. Like the number of athletes that when they accelerate or when they run are trying to stay low for, over the first couple of steps and their head and shoulders are 8 feet out in front of their feet. It's like, that's an athlete who maybe they are quote unquote self-organizing right now, but that's something for them to be an effective mover on the court or on the field. Like, they should be cued and taught how to fix. And I think one of the other issues with this idea that, we don't want to coach or change sprinting is like, I think it's a couple things. It's like, people don't know what some of the good sprinting things really are, which is why having an understanding of the mechanics and the foot strike positions and just the overall body postures and positions we want people to be in impacts how we coach and how we cue. And that, like, your setting makes a huge difference in terms of like the ability that you have to spend time working on those things. And I think with the sprinting stuff, there is this idea that it's like you're not letting people sprint if you're just working on technique all the time. And that's not really what it is at all. Like, when we're working on sprint techniques with the athletes that we train and that we work, to get back to the sport, it's not like we're spending every session working on mechanics until they finally look perfect. And then we can let them actually increase their velocity and try to run fast. Like, we're giving them one or two cues, per repetition of something to kind of work on to hopefully impact how the running changes over time. It's not this thing where you are no longer allowed to run fast if your running doesn't meet our technical model perfectly. So it's like, there's this idea of like, we see over coaching with running where people make it too cognitive and too mental, where you're trying to think about a million things. But like, I mean, when we watch like Derek Hansen coach, that was one of the things I think completely changed my mind about coaching sprinting. And it was probably because I would say, like, I was in the camp where I'm like, oh, just let him sprint, like let him do the thing. But then you watch Derek coach and he makes these unbelievable mechanical changes with a cue like up. He just says up. I just want you to think about up the whole time that you're running. Just go up, bring your arms up, get your knees up. And like, oh my God, that run looks a million times better. So it's like little simple, quick changes. If you know what you're doing and you're a great coach with someone like Derek, can make a huge difference in somebody's running mechanics and make them change their efficiency and change their actual output that they're doing. So it's like, to say it doesn't matter is almost like short-sighted to a certain degree, because you can make those changes relatively quickly, and it doesn't mean that you can't be sprinting or training acceleration and max velocity if it doesn't look quote unquote perfect right now.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what you said about, like, if you just haven't been exposed to coaching, or you haven't seen quality coaching done for anything, in this case we're talking about sprinting, but if it's like change of direction, agility work, or even like deadlifting, whatever it is, like if you haven't been exposed to good coaching or haven't learned how to coach well, then it's almost like well, I don't know how to change it, so I'm just gonna kind of let it go and hope for the best. And I definitely remember thinking about that a lot with like change of direction stuff, when I was like 23, 24 or whatever. And in my mind, it's just like, well, it's happening so fast that, like, I don't know that I would want to tell them to do something, which is like, yeah, you probably wouldn't want to tell them to do something. You want to just give them something to do, give them a constraint, or give them a drill to work on, or maybe you give them one simple cue, like you're saying, like up. And maybe that can fix things. And like, that's something that I just was never exposed to at that point in time. And now after, meeting Lee and learning a lot from Lee, as well as Derek with the course that he put on for us. It's definitely like, wow, we can really change a lot of things. And that goes back to like our profession in general. Like if you're in this profession and you're saying like, don't even bother coaching, like, why are you even here?
Right.
And, like this whole thing about like, oh, just like let them squat and like whatever squat shows up is good enough. It's like, well then, like, how do people wind up in a doctor's office like after they hurt themselves squatting? It's like they probably weren't doing it appropriately, or like their program wasn't appropriate either. Like there's a lot of different factors, but to be like, it's okay for that spine to undulate under 405 pounds because it's just self-organizing is complete trash. And that's just like, it's complete garbage. And that's just saying like, I'm useless as a professional if you're okay with that. Like, I think you guys would completely agree. And I think we're all fine saying that publicly, because why else would we have this job? And that goes back to like, you guys were talking about people showing up with like preconceived notions, or like maybe they were coached to do something one way previously. And like, what about the flip side? What if somebody did come in and they weren't coached at all in their entire life to do anything physical and move a certain way, and then you have them squat and it looks like trash? Like that doesn't mean it's good for them. Like that's what the other end of the coin would be, is like, oh, well, like whatever they do, they've never been coached, so like it's fine, it's good enough. And we're not okay with that. We have a model of movement that we want people to be close to. Nothing's perfect, and we're fine with that. And like Trevor said, we're not spending an entire hour like working on somebody's squat. Like that's also a waste of time. There's an evolution to it, and you just use the word evolution after we spoke a lot about it, but there's an evolution to it. There's a progression. It's a skill. Like everything takes time. And even within a session, like everything's an assessment. So if I'm watching a kid do some sort of like lateral cut movement and I don't really like how it looks, I might not really know right now, because I'm not an expert on that, like how to fix it in the moment, but I'm going to think about it. And the next time I see him, I'm going to have something to do with that kid. And that's what I think being a good professional should be, is like you're finding solutions for things. Maybe it's not in the moment, because if you're not skilled with that yet, then there is a solution for everything, or there should be. And it's just a matter of finding it and then letting that process happen. And, it's like nobody just wakes up one day and can squat 405. Like that takes a long time to happen. So train for a long time and practice these things. And that's what our quote unquote movement specialists, that's what we are, right? So just saying it's okay to move however you are moving, and to begin with, that's not a really, really robust specialty to me.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things that you guys made me think of is having a model of movement doesn't mean that you don't allow for individual variation. Like a good model of movement should have certain principles you expect people to abide by, but while also allowing for kind of idiosyncratic behavior. And like we talk about in our Movement Foundations course, there's always like this, the extremes are rigidity and chaos. If you're overly dogmatic and you have this model of movement that doesn't allow for any individual variation or any kind of flexibility, that's rigidity. That's no good. But chaos is nihilism. Chaos is saying like, it doesn't matter how you do anything. You're naturally going to find the right solution. Like those two extremes are both, I think, very problematic. You want to have, something that has some structure, but also allows for some flexibility. That's the interplay. It's that gray area between rigidity and chaos. That's what a good model of movement should allow for. And again, the idea that like, we're going to say that Olympic lifting is technical because we didn't evolve to do it, but sprinting is natural because we evolved to do it. In 2020, like, I don't think that sprinting at max velocity is a natural activity. So I think that teaching sprinting from a model of movement that also accounts for, individual differences in physiology and biomechanics and lever length, and also the sport somebody plays, right? Because if like a running back is accelerating, that running back might not want to have like a, that vertical line 45-degree angle, because then if they get popped, they're not going to be able to maintain their balance or change direction. Or like, if that running back knows that even near max velocity, they might have to, avoid contact. Well, if you're really upright and people are tackling you, then you're going to get pancaked. So but teaching a running back how to, run from a track and field model with decent upright mechanics, if they have those, if that running back has that available to him, he can always diverge from it when people are chasing him. But in the open field, when there's nobody around, that running back might actually be able to create more separation by having better, quote unquote, upright mechanics. So there's that. And then, Greg, to your point about like the squatting and the deadlifting, and just saying, because I have seen other threads and it's the same thread every time where it's like, oh, well, we've shown that the spine, there's no such thing as a neutral spine. The spine always moves under load. Therefore, just kind of let people do what they want when they squat or deadlift. Like, none of us would dispute that if you look at even a highly trained Olympic lifter doing a squat, or a power lifter, with electrodes and fancy equipment, that like there's going to be movement in the lumbar spine and even a little bit of flexion. But that doesn't mean that like when you're watching that person with your eyes, there's different degrees. Like, yes, some movement is always going to occur, but are you okay with that person's spine moving like an accordion? Because that's not the same as it moving a little bit. Like, there's degrees of it. Again, we're trying to avoid the extreme. So that's why I wish that instead of these abstract discussions, in a way, it's why Instagram can be very useful. It's like, show yourself or an athlete you work with squatting or deadlifting. That's going to tell everybody what you think is acceptable from a technique standpoint. Because I doubt that even the people that are saying like, there's no such thing as a neutral spine, I really doubt that when they have somebody that comes in with like back pain from squatting, they say, you know what, just do whatever you want. We're just going to lower the weight and then ramp you back up. Like, I don't think anyone is that extreme in their beliefs, but I frankly think that, especially in our profession of physical therapy, if you want to get other professionals to kind of like, applaud you, you talk about self-organization, you talk about how there's no neutral spine, there's no bad movement. And we're not saying that there is a neutral spine or that there is bad movement per se, but there's degrees of it. And if you don't have any model of movement, I don't think that that's really responsible for a physical therapist to be saying, because why are you a physio or a coach if you don't believe that there's different degrees of good and bad when it comes to movement, while also allowing for individual variation?
Anything else with that? I think we beat it up.
I mean, it's going to keep coming up because people are going to keep having the same conversations.
We'll talk about this in 6 months.
I mean, we could literally have this conversation every week because it's the same threads. And that's why, like, we always talk about, show the programming that you're doing and show what things look like, whether it's yourself or someone else, because otherwise it's just abstraction. And
then don't have a conversation unless you can do that. Because then we're just talking about nothing. You're just talking about, you're comparing what you imagine versus what somebody else is imagining, which probably isn't the same as what you're imagining. So then you're just not even talking about the same thing. It's just this vicious cycle of talking about nothing. So that's why we like to share stuff. I love it.
Because I mean, the body can adapt to anything. This is true, but I want to actually get a running researcher on to talk about like what the data shows and the research shows about running technique and injuries, because there isn't great research to show that modifying your technique necessarily changes injury. But then again, that's not the only reason to do something. Like there's performance, there's injury, risk, all these variables that would influence what kind of, mechanics you want an athlete to display. But I also hear people talk outside of both sides of their mouth, because a lot of like kind of running based physios will say, look, there's no good and bad running. It's load management. Even if you're hurt, just build yourself back up. But a lot of those same people universally endorse, hey, if you want to get back to running, increase your cadence. Well, if you increase somebody's cadence, you change their mechanics because you're going to shorten their stride. Like that's a mechanical phenomenon. It's also a neurophysiological phenomenon because you change the motor pattern, you're loading different tissues. It may change a sensation of pain, but there's no differentiating biomechanics from neurophysiology, because anytime you change something like stride length, you're going to change mechanics and you're going to change all that neurophysiology as well. So it's like people are just, it's become like a confession to say like, we coach mechanics. It's like, I don't think it's a dirty thing to say. And again, we're not saying that like we expect everyone to look and move the same, but to say that it doesn't matter at all is very disappointing. And I think scary coming from a profession where that's supposed to be like your identity. It's like, what is the identity of physical therapy if you don't believe that there's any degrees or any of good and bad movement, or that technique doesn't matter? Because coaches seem to think it matters. And if you look at even like in skiing, a sport like skiing, like even without being trained as a ski coach, you can look at different people and say, okay, like this, there's an aesthetic to good movement. And there's a reason why the people that are in the Olympics for skiing, they're doing certain things to get their skis on edge and manage forces that allow them to ski at that speed under control. And there's reasons why novices aren't able to do that. And some of it is, just pure genetic talent. Some of it's pure physical ability, but it's also the fact that like really good skiers have been coached to do certain things. And I don't think that like there's a lot of really elite skiers, as an example, that have self-organized and just done it with no coaching. I don't think there's any track and field athletes that have made it to the Olympics with no coaching, or Olympic weightlifters. So, and even, team sport athletes. So if you're a coach, there's nothing wrong with coaching. It doesn't make you bad.
Yeah. And to your point, you mentioned like being interested in, talking to a researcher and how like there's not a lot of research on mechanics and injuries and stuff like that. I even saw something about, somebody posted some research, this was months ago, about how like acute to chronic workloads with runners isn't like, significantly a thing that we should even worry about based on the research. And like, that doesn't make any sense to me too, because you're then comparing people who don't run the same to each other. And then you're just, if you put somebody who doesn't, in our world, run well enough, and then you just put a ton of volume on them, they're going to break down sooner than somebody who runs the same amount or shoots to run the same amount in our eyes. So like, even that research to me is kind of like, well, it matters. And some of these people were coached and some of these people weren't coached. So you're not even comparing apples to apples with that same research. So yeah, it just made me think of that. But if you guys don't have anything else, I think we should close this one down.
To be continued.
Awesome. To be continued. We'll do this again in a few weeks or months or whatever. But thanks for listening, and we look forward to having you back next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Resilient Performance Podcast. As a thank you for listening, we'd like to offer a 10% discount on our online products, which you can find at resilientperformance.com. We'd like you to use the promo code PODCAST, PODCAST, to get the 10% off. Right now we have the Resilient Movement Foundations course online format for you to purchase there. And we hope to grow that soon before the end of the year and have some other offerings. We hope you enjoy. Again, that's promo code PODCAST, PODCAST, for 10% off. Thanks.